Volkswagen Beetle transaxle removal. Let's go.
Hey, I'm Callahan. Welcome to Callahan's Garage.
Okay, so we're gonna do a step-by-step procedure on how to remove the transaxle from your Beetle. We've already got the car jacked up nice and high. That's gonna be step one. Step two will be getting your engine out. So if you haven't done that yet and you need a step-by-step procedure for that, I have a video for it as well. So like I said, step one, get the car jacked up nice and high. We're gonna get the wheels and tires off of it here in just a second. Let's go take a look at all the tools and stuff that we're gonna need for this. Okay, so for our transaxle removal, we're gonna need a few more tools than we did for our engine removal. And this is the first thing that we are gonna need a couple specific sizes for. So the first thing, we're gonna need a 19mm socket to get our wheels and tires off. If you don't have an impact, a breaker bar will work just fine. Then we're going to need a 36mm socket for our axle nuts, and then we're going to need a 27mm socket for our transmission mount bolts. This size may differ just slightly if you have a later model car, but the procedure for all this is going to be basically the same. Next, we have an 8mm wrench and a flathead screwdriver to get under the back seat to undo our shifter linkage. We've got 19 and 17mm wrenches, an assortment of those. And then a couple other basic hand tools will come in handy, like a pair of vice grips to get our clutch cable undone, a pair of side cutters. This will help get the cotter pins out of our axle nuts, and a pair of pliers. And like I said, general other hand tools are going to be helpful. And then we always need something to keep track of all our hardware, and a hubcap works great for that. All right, so we got the wheels and tires off. We're going to start out here on our brake drums, so we need to get these off. So in order to do that, we need to remove the cotter pin and the axle nut. This is the first thing that can be difficult on this. I've got my impact, my compressed air, my 36mm. If you don't have access to an air compressor and a hearty supply of air, invest in the torque multiplier tool to get this off. Getting this off with a breaker bar on the ground, all you're going to end up doing is rolling the car back and forth. These can be very difficult to get off. They get torqued to like 250 foot-pounds. And if they've been on there for any length of time, like I said, they can be really tricky to get off. So get you a good pair of side cutters. We're just going to get this cotter pin out of here real quick. Now we can jump on to the axle nut, and like I said, you know, with a good impact and a socket, this should come off relatively easy. But if you don't have access to something like this, that multiplier tool is a lifesaver. Okay, so we got our axle nut off. Now we need to get the drums off. Getting the drums off can be tricky as well, especially if they're adjusted correctly. So, you know, work these off of there. Also be prepared to lose some gear oil out the end of the axle if your axle seals are old and worn out. So I got a little pan down here already. And we should be able to just kind of twist on this and work it off. Look at that, this still got the original oil slingers in here. All right, so we get the drums off. Next, we're gonna undo our emergency brake cables, and these are pretty straightforward. You can just push forward on this a little bit, and that cable will pop off. Then we can undo the bolt on the back side of the backing plate, pull our parking brake cables loose. So we're going to do the same thing to the other side, and then we can keep moving on. Okay, so we got the parking brake cables pulled loose from our shoes. So now we need to undo the parking brake cable from the backing plate. So this is just a 13mm bolt on the inside of our backing plate. We can just put a wrench on it, see if it'll come out. This car is definitely a little on the crusty side, so this may be difficult if your car's got a little rust in it. Once the bolt is out, this little bracket should be able to just pull loose, and it kind of twists and pulls out of here. Sometimes you may need to get a pair of pliers to get a good grab on this and get it out. But if you can rotate it upwards, typically it'll come out. you could pull the whole parking brake cable loose out of the backing plate. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is disconnect our brake lines. You want to make sure you do this before we take the axle loose from the spring plate. Otherwise, this axle is going to be flopping around. It's going to make this a lot more difficult, especially if yours look half as crusty as these do. Now, normally I would just cut these hoses that we're going to change out anyway, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to show you how to get these loose, and I'm going to give you a trick for doing these. And this is just a 17mm wrench on your hose side and an 11mm wrench on our hardline side. Now, if you go and put a regular wrench or even a line wrench on here on these crusty old fittings, a lot of times they will round over and they will break off and strip loose. But this tool right here, this Flex Force line wrench, this is an absolute lifesaver. I've had a set of these for years. Snap-on used to make these and now they're manufactured by this Flex Force. I just bought these off eBay years and years ago. But the way this works is it just loops around your hard line, and the more pressure you put on it, the harder it's going to squeeze on that fitting. So I have busted loose the crustiest fittings with these, and it's always been a lifesaver. And these even have a hole in the center where you can put a ratchet into them and get a little bit more leverage on here. There we go. So you can see how crusty it is, and that broke it loose easily. And now we can just finish taking it loose with our regular wrench. Okay, so I got this fitting cracked loose, but you can see it's just twisting our hard line as well. So we're going to end up replacing these. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut both of our hoses, and those will be disconnected. Also keep in mind, if you cut any of this or when you take this loose, you're going to lose some brake fluid, so be prepared for that. Okay, so next we're going to take our shocks loose, and we just have a straightforward bolt on the top and the bottom of it. Typically these are a 17mm on the bolt side, 19mm on the nut side, and just use your wrenches or a ratchet. I'm going to use the impact and bust these off and get both of our shocks out of the way, and we can keep moving on. And a lot of times these lower shock mount bolts can get really stuck in this cast shock mount arm. So if you do end up needing to hammer on these, just make sure you thread a nut back onto the end of it before you go wailing on your bolt and trashing the threads on the end of your bolt. Okay, so the next thing we've got to do is we've got to take our axle tubes loose from our spring plate. And this is the first thing that can be really tricky and really frustrating, because we've got 3 big 19mm bolts and they are really on there, and there's no really good way to get anything onto them. So you can get kind of a ratchet on this side, but all you can get onto the nut side is a wrench. So a lot of times these are just really difficult to break loose and get off of here. So just take your time, work at it. I'm going to try to throw an impact on here and bust these off. But like I said, just take your time, be patient. These will come off. It just takes a few minutes. And this one's a real pain because our brake line mount is in the way. It's really tricky to get in on this side. Okay, so we got all 3 of these broken loose. I'm just going to take a few minutes to get them all the way off, and then we will be loose. Also, if you're planning on reusing your bump stop, set it somewhere aside, hang on to it, because these are rarely ever on here. Okay, so I got the nuts and bolts taken out of this side as well. So now our axle tubes should be totally loose from our spring plate. Our brake line's already loose, our parking brake cables are already loose, so the axle tubes should be totally free at this point. Now we can move on to getting the actual transaxle loose. Okay, next we're going to take loose the starter. Now I'm replacing this starter, so I'm going to just take it completely out. If you're not replacing your starter, all you need to do is take loose your power cable. So this is our battery cable. This is our power cable that goes up to the generator. And then this has an aftermarket hot start solenoid on it. We're going to yank that out anyway. So we can disconnect our signal wire from our ignition switch. So this is just a 13mm nut here on our main power lug. So we can just take it off, take all of our cables loose. And then we just have this one 17mm nut on the bottom of the starter mount. our top starter mount is shared with the engine mount bolt, and that's already out. Now we'll just yank this old 6-volt junk out of here. So next we have our transmission nose cone mount that we need to take loose, and you can either take it loose from the transaxle itself, or you can take it loose from the body. Either one of these mounts will allow you to get the transaxle out. I'm going to be replacing this, so I'm just going to take it loose from the body and pull it out with the transaxle. But also note that this is where our transmission ground strap is. We need to make sure that comes loose as well, and it shares this mount here. Also keep in mind, this may look a little bit different depending on what year car you're working on, but it all works basically the same, where our transmission mount mounts to the body somewhere, and then our transaxle bolts up to that mount. Okay, so next we need to get our clutch cable loose, and usually I just like to take a pair of vice grips, clamp them onto the end of our cable here, and then normally you have a wing nut right here. You can just thread that off by hand, hopefully. This one has a couple of incorrect nuts on here, so I can figure out what size those are and get them off. Okay, now we got our clutch cable loose. We can just pull it out of the arm, and then you can take the clutch guide tube loose. Sometimes these are really a pain in the butt to get out, so a lot of times I'll just leave it until we pull the transmission back a little bit, and it'll make that a lot easier to get loose. And one last thing, underneath the back seat we need to undo our shifter linkage. So you've got your shifter basket, shifter couplings. This will look a little bit different depending on what car you're working on, but we just need to undo this one 8mm square bolt off of our hockey stick. So we're just going to pop this little guy loose. Sometimes these can really be tricky to get on with these square head bolts. But just pop this guy loose, try to not drop it down into the tunnel. Set this aside, make sure you don't lose it because it is this little tapered bolt, and then we can just pull our shifter linkage loose. A lot of times this will just pop loose. You can just grab the shifter and kind of work it loose. You may have to get a pry bar, get it off of there, which it looks like we're going to have to do. There we go. So just pop it loose, and you can see on our front bolt here, this is still safety wired. So a lot of times this may still have some safety wire running through it that you'll have to cut before you can take that out. Okay, so we got everything disconnected from our transaxle. Now we're ready to take it out. So the last thing we need to do, just pop our two big transmission mount bolts out, and then we can slide this thing out of here. Now, just like our engine, if we take these out, our transmission isn't going to fall out of here or anything like that. However, if you have good axle boots that you want to save, you are going to want to put some pressure up on the bottom of the transaxle with your jack before you take these loose. That way we don't drag these axle boots across our frame horns and tear them if we're trying to make sure they stay in good shape. But as you can see, mine are wasted. So I'm just going to pop these bolts out, and then we'll pull this thing out of here. So we're just going to put our jack pretty much right under the drain plug. That's where most of the weight of the transmission is. And we're just going to take a little bit of the weight off of it, and then we can just grab the whole thing and start pulling it out. Just kind of work this thing backwards a little bit. Make sure your clutch tube comes out like we mentioned before. It's a little stuck. I think we're going to have to get a hammer, tap that out of there. All right, well, we're good and sweaty now, but we got our transaxle out. You can see we lost a little bit of gear oil pulling this thing out of there. That boot was a little more torn than we could tell before that axle started flopping around. But this thing's pretty grimy. We'll get this thing pressure washed up here soon, and we'll start tearing this apart and putting a seal kit in it before we put it back in the car. So I hope this helps you out. In the last video, we did the engine removal, and we're gonna have a bunch more mechanical how-to videos as I get some more work done on this Beetle. So if there's something specific that you wanna see, leave it in the comments. If you got any questions, put them in the comments and I'll try to get back to you. But thanks for watching. See you guys next time.